won't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. And if that mockingbird won't sing, Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring.
I've had some questions since last time about why we didn't arrest Marshall and interrogate him. We did question him. The way it works is that the police arrest, interrogate, gather evidence, and then the CPS decide whether or not we can charge them and it goes to trial. We pushed for our superior to let us arrest him after we found the diary. When he was against it, we went above his head. We went to the CPS. We went to everyone we could go to. We gathered evidence, but it still was not enough. The commissioner wasn't having it. He told us to stop harassing the kid and to put it away, that the Summertons were dead, and that was that. With adoption, there's always a paper trail, especially when the kid was taken into care. Then we had snippets of information that all seemed to fit together, but not quite enough apparently. I'm convinced, all of us are, that Marshall was somehow behind it. But when the commissioner asked us how a 6-year-old child forced his surgeon father to mutilate a young man for him, made his father build a huge basement, operating theater, jail, and then compelled him to continue for almost 2 decades, we kind of came up empty. He said the CPS would never take this evidence and think that a conviction was likely, so we had to stop wasting resources. Even the rape wasn't pursued, like so many others. CPS just said there was no physical evidence. She got straight back into the pool afterwards, and we didn't examine her until weeks afterwards. Didn't know about the rape for even longer. They also said that she would be an unreliable witness. There were no reliable witnesses. Only people who heard from Murr, and those were either victims of horrific mutilations or they were dead. If you ever wonder why rape convictions are as low as they are, well, here you go. We need it to be beyond reasonable doubt. We need to prove to CPS it has a good chance, or won't just be wasting money on a crusade. In the film version of this, it'd be different. Maybe Marshall would even kidnap one of us to start working on, and then the feisty sidekick would kick down the door, point a gun at him, and arrest him. The commissioner would pat us all on the back and admit he was wrong. Marshall would rot in jail, sadly sketching little mythical creatures on the wall of his cell for the rest of his natural life, while we all got medals and that chick from high school we still crush on. But this is reality, and that doesn't happen. It didn't happen. Marshall was taken into care when he was 4. He had 2 brothers and 1 sister. He was the youngest. The home situation was volatile, and social services had an eye on them from before Marshall was even born. His mother never stopped drinking, smoking, or whatever else when she was pregnant, and died at the end of her pregnancy, so he was born by C-section. His father was a laborer who left the kids alone most of the days when he was working. So far, it just seemed like a distressed parent trying to juggle 4 kids, a 12-hour day working, and grief from his girlfriend dying. Marshall was the only one out of the lot that did not have some form of disability or deformity. His sister was born with a cleft lip. Social services noted that he was very fond of his sister, trying to cover it with some pink Play-Doh once and telling her she's pretty now. These things are usually operated on when the kid's still a baby. There was no explanation of why she still had it. One of his older brothers had extreme upper limb reduction. His forearms were bent backwards and tiny. I assume that's why his dad kept calling him Rex. And a second brother was born with, I think it's called encephalocele. Basically a lump on the head with a load of tissue in it. He could never use his arms and legs properly and had seizures that his parents never looked after properly. In another supervised play session, Marshall drew a face on the lump and would only speak to that face. The way he'd play with his brothers and sisters seemed cute to social services. The lack of medical care wasn't quite enough to take the kids away from their father, even though it was obvious to everyone that he wasn't coping properly. These things can and do fall through the cracks. But most of the time, people don't want to take kids away from their parents unless something really bad happens. That was why they stayed there until he did it. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but the dad clearly had enough. They found extremely high levels of alcohol and coke in the corpse, and Marshall alone in the house, surrounded by the pieces of his brothers and sisters. I only know this from the reports. I never saw it, but apparently the dad had cut the children into chunks. At the time, they thought he was the one to rearrange them. This leg with that body, etc. Now I'm not so sure. The dad then locked himself in the toilet and killed himself. Marshall was found in the house a few days later when it started to stink. The foster family said that Marshall was a quiet, well-behaved kid. He didn't throw tantrums, ate when it was time to eat, slept when it was time to sleep, and would spend hours sitting and drawing. He loved being read to before bed, especially fairy tales. Obviously, the foster family were academics. They read the classics in Latin and Greek. They had after-school lessons with the kids to teach them extra reading, help them with creative writing, that kind of thing. Every single child in their care thrived. I wonder how much those early years impacted Marshall's desires. Without these loving people, would he even know the stories he tried to recreate? We never told them what he became. The Somertons adopted him a couple of years later and brought him into their mansion. Mrs. Somerton had polycystic ovaries and didn't want to try any of the most extreme fertile treatments to conceive. She was perfectly happy to adopt. They looked like the perfect family for it. A doctor husband, a wife who could stay at home with the kid, huge garden to play in with lots of woods and fields, more money than anyone could ever need, and no real family on either side. So they desperately wanted to make their own. Mr. Somerton, Mark, came from money, which is where the trust funds all came from, but his parents died on a trip when he was young, and he was raised by his grandparents. They didn't know the gory details of the murder, just that the parents were both dead and his brothers and sisters had been killed. They had no priors, nothing at all that suggested they'd be anything other than another rich, boring family who went skiing in winter and worried too much what other people thought. In therapy, Marshall only spoke about his biological father's actions once. He said, "Daddy made them better. They're all better now." About 6 months after Marshall was adopted, they went to the agency again to ask for another child. Marshall wanted someone to play with. They said he came from a family with brothers and sisters, so maybe he needed siblings. Shortly after, they withdrew the application and said it was fine. He was better off as an only child. Looking at the dates, we put it together with the first time his parents were called and someone made a note of his behavior. He was drawing a cleft lip on one of his classmates with a red felt tip. The second time, he cut the sleeve off one of his classmates' cardigans and made another classmate wear it. The third time, he glued a classmate's legs together because she said she liked mermaids. It was only PVA glue, so it washed off. The final time, he killed the class hamster and glued it to another classmate's head. It was super glue this time. It was the final straw. Nobody saw the escalation. First drawing, then cutting clothes, then actual skin contact, then killing, and more permanent, for a kid anyway, modification. He was stepping it up each time, even at that age. He was seeing what he could do and get away with. I'm no shrink, but it's obvious enough to me. He did have a shrink, obviously. They tried to talk about the cleft lip and the sleeve. They seemed the most closely linked to his family and what he witnessed. He said he was just playing, and everyone dismissed the gluing. Some things don't seem important at the time. They were worried about the hamster too, but since he'd never tried to set anything on fire and didn't wet the bed, it wasn't part of the psychopath triad, so they left that too. We have a gap in the records or notable changes, and then 2 years later, they took Fawn. Marshall was 8 at that point, and on his third prestigious school. a prep school where he refused boarding. He was a well-behaved, quiet kid again who'd stopped gluing things to classmates and spent break times drawing more and more elaborate fairy tale scenes. When people asked him where he knew the stories from, it was like he'd forgotten all about his foster family and just said, "My daddy." Then again, maybe he meant the foster father even though he only called them by their names. Who knows? We could never trace the murdered boy that Mrs. Somerton mentioned. No children missing from sleepovers. No runaways that never came back. We never found out the identity. But we did find a small boy in the pit, roughly 7 years old at the time of his death, and buried for 16 years. When we presented this to the commissioner, asking to bring him in again, arrest him, ask the victims if they'll testify, he refused. We didn't want him for rape. We wanted him for the whole damn thing. He just repeated that Marshall was a troubled kid who sat with dismembered corpses for days on end. Of course, he was going to act out. But unless we explained how he forced his parents to kidnap Fawn at the beginning and how he made them continue with it, there was no case. Marshall, however, could use the family money and family attorneys to sue us as a group and personally for harassing him as a victim of numerous crimes. I found feedback from his art degree when searching the house.
You continue to exceed expectations and exhibit improvement and skill in digital manipulation. Your final piece this term, Siren, was the highlight of the show and elicited extreme responses in every visitor. The way that you took a classical subject and made it grotesque without compromising on a single detail of the original myth is just brilliant. However, as always, you do not show the full progression of your work and how you achieved your aims, which is why you will not receive a 1-1 at the completion of this degree if you do not start handing in your full work. In order to improve your coursework, you need to show how you manipulated the work in your original files. For example, prior to completing Siren, you need to offer the original photograph of the subject as well as the file showing the scarification and burn marks that were later applied to the photograph. You can't just hand in a single final piece and expect that to get top marks, regardless of how well executed it is. That said, it would be fantastic to see an entire exhibit of these pieces. Continue along these lines, and I will be happy to support you in trying to gain an exhibition space and publicity for your show. Come to me with a body of work, 8 to 20 pieces, and we'll talk.
We found flyers for his exhibition too, the one his tutor encouraged him to do. Myrrh was the cover image. The catalog was full of photos of them, Daff, Fawn, even Minotaur, sitting in the woods or by the pool looking at him. There was Narcissus too, just as pretty as Mrs. Somerton described him, and crying as he looked at his reflection in a pond. He fucking gloated to the entire world about what was going on in that house. He showed us, and the Chelsea wives paid thousands to hang that stuff on their walls, or look edgy as they bought them to put their prints in the basement, where nobody would have to look. We gave that to the commissioner too, practically begging him. I thought he was an idiot back then. Now I realize Marshall just paid him off. He could easily play it as the Somertons are dead, Marshall is the victim, we'll get sued. But really he was 3 years away from retirement. Cash talks. I hope he remembers their faces at least. So what happened in the end? In the end, the house was sold, and most of the proceeds went towards paying compensation to the victims. Some were paid more, some less, but none of them were paid enough. Eventually, most of them banded together and bought a house where they could live in some peace. None of them had their own rooms this time. Stevens would visit them, Cox too. Then we'd drink and wonder if their lives are any better now than before they were rescued. They were more cramped. They didn't have Mrs. Somerton looking after them. Any day Marshall could find them again. Most of them didn't get in touch with their families. They figured it was better to think they were dead. The ones that did regretted it. A few were completely rejected. Others never really knew how to have a life back at home with the people who knew them by different names. Some of them had corrective surgery. Daff had all the stuff taken out of her head but left the rest. Uni got his Achilles tendon fixed and the horn taken out. He stands at about 6'4" now, still looking after them at the house. Some of them killed themselves. Griff, Minotaur. Minotaur didn't know how to be around the rest of them. Couldn't go back to the labyrinth where he felt safe. There's no way for someone like that to exist unless he had it all undone, which he couldn't do. We had him committed at first, hoping some drugs and therapy would do him good. He got aggressive and gored a nurse with his horn, then ran away. After a few years, all of the money was gone. Buying a house with plenty of land took basically all of it. Most of them were young when they were taken and didn't know how to manage. State benefits are never enough to really live off. They didn't want to sue Marshall. They were still terrified of him. Eventually, the ones who could work got jobs. Uni was a bouncer. Fawn started a dropship business online, selling t-shirts and stuff. They tried to stop the girls from working it, but it did no good. Murr and Harpy, they started off as cam girls. They found the dark web somehow, or it found them, and they started selling themselves on there. I don't know what's worse, that they ended up living like that, how much people pay, or just how many men are eager to do it. Marshall had to sell his childhood home, and that was about it. We were never allowed to interrogate him further after the initial questioning. We wanted to seize more assets, but most of the family money was in a trust. All they did was take Marshall off the trust until the action was discontinued, and then put him back in. It's how they all kept their wealth intact. I wanted the house leveled after everyone was out of it, but some Saudi billionaire bought it. I went there once, hoping to see Marshall and give him his mother's diary, partially because I had to, but also because I wanted to look him in the eye and show him I knew. Someone knew. Someone who isn't scared of him. There was no forwarding address, so I went to the house and saw him driving in on a new Mercedes. He just waved, but didn't stop. Nobody answered when I buzzed, over and over again. Nobody answered when I shouted to let me in. I checked the electoral roll every so often, checking where he is. He still lives there, a guest of the buyer apparently. Stevens, Cox, and Jones all keep very unofficial tabs on him, but that's all we can do. We sometimes get shit-faced and talked about killing him. I wonder if they will. I'm sorry that there was no justice here. No goodness either. No happy ending. The rich get away with it. The evil too. Every year that passes, more of the victims kill themselves. I see Stevens drink himself closer to the grave. I read newspaper stories of abused children who weren't taken out in time. I hear about people disappearing and never being found. I wonder how many of these stories will end up tied together. I wonder if justice could ever exist. I wonder if we missed anything in that house. Hey guys, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed, like, share with your friends, leave a comment below, and remember to subscribe so you can catch all my future content. My name is Manic. Until next time, remember,
Be good to each other.